Let's keep the sports theme going from yesterday's video. There's a coach speak phrase out there that it's thrown around when talking strategy, and that phrase is, a good offense is a good defense. Another one we coaches like to use is, offense wins games, but defense wins championships. The concept around both of these phrases is that 9 times out of 10, the best way to win a game is to play it safe and play defense. And really, you're waiting for your opponent to get tired and make a mistake before you make your move. And that's exactly what George Washington and the Continental Army did in 1776. If you haven't guessed it by now, we're going to be talking about the different strategies that Great Britain used and the ones that George Washington used. I'll let you be the judge when this is all over as to which team had the better strategy, Great Britain or America. The British and the American armies used different war strategies. The British fought an offensive war. They attacked the Continental Army and aimed to control key cities. On the other hand, the Continental troops fought a defensive war. Their goal was to protect themselves from attacks by the British Army rather than to destroy it. So right out of the gate, the book tells us how each side fought. The British was more attack-heavy and offensive, while the Americans were more protective and defensive. And initially, this all-out offensive attack worked pretty well for the British. In June of 1775, they won the Battle of Bunker Hill, which helped them capture the city of Boston. There's no doubt about it, this was a pretty ugly loss for the Continental Army. But remember in yesterday's video, we talked about how motivation can be a massive boost of confidence for you. And despite this loss, George Washington and his troops still did pretty heavy damage to the British Army. And so even though they took the L in this fight, they still felt pretty confident for future fights based on how they performed in this one. Chuck Noll, who was a legendary NFL coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers, once said, "I'd rather play well and lose than play poorly and win." There's no doubt about it that the Continental Army lost that fight of Bunker Hill, but they played their hearts out and they walked away with a lot learned. And in fact, a year later in 1776, they had taken what they learned and were able to capture the city of Boston back from the British. Unfortunately, just a few months after that, Great Britain took the city of New York and chased Washington's troops out, which led them to believe that the war was basically over. But Washington still had a few tricks up his sleeve. However, Washington moved his men into the countryside. There, the Continental Army used tactics not common for that time. For example, Patriot troops made surprise attacks on small groups of British soldiers and then retreated. Sharpshooters hid in the woods and shot British soldiers one by one. This style of fighting is called guerrilla warfare, and no, I'm not talking about this guerrilla. The word actually has a Spanish origin, and this style of fighting wasn't really officially named until the 19th century, which was well after the American Revolution. And so due to their small size, this style of fighting actually worked really well for the Continental Army. Plus, we know that Great Britain didn't really know the land as well as the colonists, so sneaking up and making these surprise attacks was actually a really efficient strategy, and the British really weren't amused by this. The Continental Army did not use these tactics often during the war, but when they did, the tactics puzzled British troops, who preferred to meet their enemy face to face. The tactics used by the colonists helped them gain an advantage over the British. The British were a very proper army and preferred to use your classic rank and file formation for face-to-face fighting like seen in this picture. This random small group fighting style that the colonists used really threw the British off their game, who were more used to this formal face-to-face fighting. And as such, they weren't really ever ready to properly defend themselves because they never knew when the attacks were coming. And when things aren't going the way you expect, you do have to change up your strategy, which is exactly what Great Britain did. But so did George Washington. So the British changed their strategy. They tried to use their better trained troops to openly engage Washington's troops in battles. But one night in December 1776, Washington sneaked his troops across the Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. There, in the Battle of Trenton, they surprised and defeated German mercenaries who were celebrating Christmas, winning a key early Patriot victory. If you're the German mercenaries, this is the worst possible Christmas gift you could ever ask for. If you're the Continental Army, though, this is the best possible gift you could ever ask for. And this picture here is perhaps the most iconic Revolutionary War picture out there. In it, you can see George Washington being the fearless leader, leading his troops behind him. Also notice that this was not the most ideal time to cross a river. Remember, this is in the dead of winter on the East Coast. Notice the soldiers in the front and on the sides moving away all the frozen ice blocks. Washington was prepared to do whatever it took to be victorious in this war. And if that meant crossing a frozen river on Christmas, then so be it. If you needed further proof that the Continental Army was motivated to win, this is it. So obviously, after all these surprise attacks, Great Britain was getting very angry. By 1777, the British generals were determined to force Washington's army into the open. To do this, the British took the key city of Philadelphia. They defeated Washington's army near Philadelphia, but failed to destroy it. Bit of a good news, bad news situation here. The British captured a major city, but thanks to the defensive fighting by Washington, the army was still intact. So, Washington then moved his men to Valley Forge to camp for the winter and train them. This location was easy to defend and close enough to York, Pennsylvania to protect Congress as it met there. If Great Britain had captured Congress, there's no telling how bad this would have been for America. This cat and mouse game that the British Army and the Continental Army were playing was going to be over. And so it was in Valley Forge in the dead of winter that our Continental Army faced their greatest challenge yet with no sign of hope. Until tomorrow. For now though, let's pause and take some notes on what we just finished talking about. Just like yesterday, we are going to be on page 80, but we're going to be in section 5 this time where it's labeled different war strategies. And so we know from today that the British were more offensive while the Continental Army was more defensive. Our notes also tell us this, but we're going to get a little more specific here and write down 3 tactics that each side used while they were fighting in the war. Let's start with the British and their offensive game plan. For starters, it looks like Great Britain was a big fan of the most famous rivalry in all of sports, because they first controlled Boston in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then they followed that up by capturing the key city of New York. And then, when they were able to, Great Britain really liked defeating the Continental Army in face-to-face fighting since they had the superior soldiers. These tactics did work and were rather effective in certain moments, but just because you have a good offense doesn't mean you're going to win. Remember, offense wins games, defense wins championships. And the team with the better defense in the 1700s was the Continental Army. Let's take a look at some of the tactics that they used. First and foremost, because they were such a small army, they avoided facing the British in wide open spaces. Instead, they preferred to make surprise attacks against British soldiers in the countryside. Remember, home field advantage was a very real thing. And lastly, in addition to these surprise attacks, the Continental soldiers took to the trees and became snipers, picking the British soldiers off one by one. So as you can see, both armies had different strategies, and both of them actually worked pretty well. I'll let you in on a little secret though when it comes to strategy. The best coaches, or in this case military leaders, use the best strategy available, whether they like it or not. If this strategy is going to help them win, then they'll use it. It may not be their favorite one, but if it gets them the results they're looking for, why not use it? Your best ability is your adaptability. If you can adapt to any situation going on, you're more likely to be successful. Because the Continental Army could adapt to so many different situations and use a lot of unique strategies not often used in this era, they were able to find more success than the more offensive-minded British. But despite all that strategy, they still needed some help. So what do you think we're going to be talking about in tomorrow's video? But guys, that's going to do it for today's daily dose of history. Be sure to head back to Google Classroom and answer our question of the day. And another reminder, on Friday, unless you're my class, in which case we already talked about this, is our review session on Zoom. I will be sending out those invitations to you tomorrow, so be on the lookout for those. And just one last reminder again, your States and Capitals quiz is at the end of the month on the 29th, so be sure you're studying those maps. So with that being said, I'll see you right here tomorrow.